If you want to understand what really breaks an empire, finances do not start with the stock market, do not start with the slogans, do not start with whatever politician is pretending to be in control this week. Start with the rollover machine. That is where the truth lives. Most people think debt is a pile. It is not a pile. It is a moving belt. It is a conveyor. It matures, rolls, reprices, compounds, and then returns demanding more oxygen than it required the last time around. That is why I do not look at the United States debt problem as a single giant number and stop there. $39 trillion is a frightening number. Yes, but frightening numbers by themselves do not teach enough. A child can be frightened by a number. An investor needs to know the mechanism. The mechanism is this: America is no longer merely carrying a giant debt burden. America is trapped inside a refinancing machine, and a refinancing machine behaves very differently from the way most ordinary people imagine. The first thing they imagine is that debt is stable until somebody chooses to repay it. That is not how sovereign debt works in the real world. Large governments do not sit down and lovingly write a check that clears the whole balance. They refinance, matured debt is replaced with new debt, low-rate debt disappears, and higher-rate debt takes its place. The machine keeps moving, and as long as buyers keep showing up at acceptable yields, the public can pretend nothing fundamental has changed. That is how long debt eras survive. Not because the math is beautiful, because the auctions still clear. That is why the headline I care about is not simply that foreign central banks dumped $82 billion of Treasury holdings in a month. The number matters, but the signal matters more. What matters is that the seller stepped away from the table precisely when the table was already preparing for one of the largest refinancing waves in modern American history. That is not random. That is not cosmetic. That is a crack appearing in the one place the system least wants a crack. If you are going to understand the next phase of this cycle, you need to understand 5 things. You need to understand the buyer. You need to understand the rollover. You need to understand the yield. You need to understand trust. And you need to understand the trap. Once those 5 pieces lock together, a lot of comforting nonsense stops working. Let me begin with the buyer. For a long time, the world treated us treasuries as the clean shirt in a dirty closet. Maybe not perfect, but safe enough, liquid enough, large enough, and politically stable enough that when stress rose, money ran toward Washington's debt market rather than away from it. That reflex was one of the great hidden subsidies of American power. It lowered borrowing costs. It widened the margin for fiscal stupidity. It allowed the United States to behave for long stretches as though the global appetite for its debt were some natural resource lying under the ground. It is not. It is confidence. Confidence is the most mispriced asset in every long cycle because people only notice its value after they begin losing it. When foreign official buyers reduce their Treasury holdings, the first mistake amateurs make is to treat that move as a passing vote on rates. They say perhaps those countries needed liquidity, perhaps they had energy bills, perhaps it is temporary fine. All of those can be true and still miss the deeper point. The deeper point is this: the automatic buyer is becoming less automatic. That matters more than the monthly number. If a long-standing structural buyer turns into a selective buyer, then yields must begin doing more of the persuading. And once yields must persuade, the terms of power begin changing. That is why I keep returning to what I call the buyer-S retreat. A buyer-S retreat is not a dramatic collapse in demand all at once. It is the moment a habitual buyer becomes a conditional buyer that is enough to change the whole tone of the market. The empire that had grown accustomed to being funded by reflex now has to be funded by price. That is a humiliating transition for any debtor. It is doubly humiliating for a debtor that still wishes to behave like a hegemon. The present logic is not complicated. The Iran war hit, oil rose. Countries that import oil suddenly needed more dollars to pay for the same energy. Their own currencies came under pressure. So what did they do? They sold some of what was liquid treasuries. You can look at Turkey, India, Thailand, and other likely sellers through that lens, and the move makes immediate sense. A nation under pressure chooses its own monetary stability over subsidizing America. That's refinancing comfort, of course it does. That is not a betrayal, that is realism. And once realism enters the Treasury market in size, the old comforting myths start to wobble. Now we come to the second thing you must understand. The rollover. The United States has to refinance roughly $10 trillion of debt in 2026. That number is so large that many people hear it and glaze over. They think it is too big to mean anything concrete. That is a dangerous psychological trick. Large numbers stop feeling real precisely when they become most important. So make it concrete. A third of all marketable debt is effectively walking toward the window to be reissued. Much of it was issued during the cheap money years, near zero rates, pandemic-era yields. Emergency conditions, that debt is now maturing into a very different world. And debt does not politely remember the era it came from. It gets rolled at the price of the present, not the nostalgia of the past. That is why I call this the rollover shock. A rollover shock happens when old debt born in an era of cheap financing must be refinanced in an era where the cost of money has changed enough to alter the fiscal destiny of the borrower. A household feels this with a mortgage reset. A company feels it when short-term funding must be renewed. A government feels it at scale. And scale is what makes the public underestimate the pain. They think scale means immunity. Often scale simply means delay. Every percentage point higher in refinancing cost on $10 trillion means roughly another $100 billion of annual interest burden. Pause there. $100 billion is not theory. It is a recurring toll. And that toll arrives not because the government built something new or solved something old, but because yesterday, S debt aged in today, S rates. That is the invisible violence of the rollover machine. It punishes the past by billing the future. That brings us to the third thing, yield. Yield is the language the bond market uses when trust is no longer free. For years, many investors made a basic assumption that if geopolitical fear rose, Treasury yields would fall because money would run to safety. That reflex is deeply embedded in market thinking. The trouble is that reflex depends on the same confidence architecture I mentioned earlier. If confidence in the fiscal and monetary path is weakening, then even a global crisis may not produce the old pattern cleanly. That is exactly what makes this moment so revealing. Treasuries have shown too little of the old safe haven response. Auctions have required higher yields than expected. The 10-year climbed from the high threes toward the mid-fours. The 2-year jumped hard as well. That is not how a system behaves when the market is fully comfortable financing it at old assumptions. That is how a system behaves when it is beginning to pay what I call the trust premium. A trust premium is the extra compensation buyers demand when they no longer treat your paper as automatically sacred. This is where a lot of otherwise intelligent commentary fails. People say yields are up because inflation is sticky, or because the Fed is still restrictive, or because there is too much supply. Fine, those are pieces. But underneath those pieces is one deeper truth. More buyers now need more persuasion. That persuasion is yield. Yield is the bill confidence sends when it is no longer willing to work for free. Once you understand the trust premium, you stop reading rising yields as a random market twitch. You begin reading them as a referendum. If the largest borrower in the world must keep offering more income to find enough love, then the love is changing in character. Love used to be structural. Now it is increasingly transactional. That is a regime shift. The fourth thing you must understand is trust itself. Trust is the hidden reserve asset behind every reserve currency. The dollar system did not become dominant merely because America was large. It became dominant because America was liquid, legally coherent, institutionally credible, militarily powerful, and financially disciplined enough relative to others that the rest of the world preferred to sit inside its architecture. That architecture has been eroding in slow motion for years, not collapsing, eroding. Those are different things. I am not here to sell you carnival collapse fantasies. I am here to tell you that erosion is what matters, because erosion forces price changes before headlines catch up. The reserve share of the dollar has been under gradual pressure. Allies and rivals alike have been building payment alternatives, reserve alternatives, gold reserves, local currency settlement mechanisms, and regional financial redundancies. Again, not because the dollar disappears next week, because optionality matters when trust no longer feels permanent. That is what the recent Treasury selling is really telling you. Not that the dollar order is over, that it is more conditional than it used to be. And conditional trust is far more expensive to fund than reflexive trust. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the reserve fracture. A reserve fracture begins long before the public would dare call it by that name. It begins when central banks and governments start acting as if dependence on dollar assets is a strategic choice rather than an unquestionable default. It begins when gold repatriation becomes politically thinkable. It begins when payment networks are duplicated. It begins when, in a crisis, countries sell treasuries to protect themselves rather than hoard treasuries to protect themselves. That last point matters the most, because if the old safe haven reflex becomes less reliable in the very moments when America needs it most, the rollover machine becomes harsher. Now we arrive at the fifth and final thing, the trap. A trap is not merely a bad situation. A trap is a bad situation where each attempted solution strengthens the conditions that created the problem. That is what the United States faces. If rates stay high, the refinancing machine becomes brutal, more debt rolls into higher coupons, interest costs rise, deficits widen, more borrowing is needed just to service the burden, the machine accelerates. If rates are pushed lower aggressively through intervention, the message to the market is not clean relief. It can easily become something darker. It can say desperation. It can say the state is no longer managing debt. It is suppressing the cost of debt because honest market pricing became intolerable. That weakens trust. A weaker trust base can push long rates up anyway, weaken the dollar, or intensify capital flight at the margin. In other words, the first solution risks worsening the fiscal math, and the second risk worsening the confidence math. That is why I call it the refinancing trap. The trap is not that there is debt. The trap is that each policy pathway now threatens something essential. Keep yields elevated, and the debt service burden grows like a weed through concrete, force yields lower, and the signal may damage the very trust base needed to preserve the Treasury market's privileged status. This is why I say the real story is not America must refinance $10 trillion. The real story is America must refinance $10 trillion while the buyers are growing less automatic, the trust premium is rising, and every policy exit now carries an obvious side effect. That is a much more serious sentence. Now, I want to talk about the knock-on effects because this is where most people still get lazy. They think of the Treasury market as a detached technical arena for specialists in suits. That is childish. The Treasury market is the base layer of American pricing, mortgage rates, corporate funding, credit spreads, equity valuations, private equity assumptions, commercial real estate cap rates, venture math, pension return hopes. Everything drinks from this river. When the river changes direction, every downstream promise must reprice. That is why rising Treasury yields are not just a bond story. They are an everything story. A 10-year yield closer to 4.4% than 3.4% does not merely annoy fixed income traders. It forces equity investors to compare real yields against risky multiples. It forces the federal government to allocate more tax revenue toward debt service rather than productive capacity. It forces corporations refinancing their own obligations to swallow higher expense. It forces private asset owners to admit that the discount rates embedded in their valuations were fantasies. It forces commercial real estate already weak into even uglier arithmetic. It forces the future to pay more for the past. That is how a refinancing machine slowly drains vitality from a financial empire. People often ask me when a debt problem becomes a growth problem. That is the wrong question. A debt problem becomes a growth problem the moment net interest starts crowding out productive deployment. Every dollar spent on old borrowing is a dollar not spent on building, training, repairing, defending, innovating, or upgrading anything real. That is why I call interest on excessive debt dead rent. Dead rent is money paid to maintain yesterday without generating enough tomorrow. A healthy borrower can afford some rent. An unhealthy borrower begins living inside it. America is moving deeper into dead rent. That matters more than most policy debates because dead rent does not scream. It just subtracts. It subtracts options. It subtracts future policy room. It subtracts resilience. It subtracts credibility. And eventually, if the machine keeps running long enough, it subtracts the illusion that time alone will solve the math. That is why I think so many investors are still using the wrong frame. They keep asking whether the Treasury market will crash or whether yields will spike. Those are surface questions. The better question is whether America's funding model is becoming more fragile, more dependent on price concessions, and more vulnerable to external pressure at exactly the wrong time. I think the answer is yes. Now, what do I do with that answer? The first thing I do is stop pretending that long-duration safety is safe, simply because it is called government debt. Duration risk is not abolished by patriotism. If the refinancing machine is becoming harsher, then long-term paper is not where I want my peace of mind stored. The second thing I do is raise my respect for liquidity. When systems get trapped, liquidity becomes moral power. The man with dry powder does not have to sell what he loves to fund what he needs. He can wait, he can act, he can purchase from pressure instead of becoming part of it. That is a beautiful position in any market under strain. The third thing I do is increase my respect for real assets and pricing power. If the debt trap is eventually answered with some version of monetary easing, yield suppression, currency debasement, or all three in sequence, then assets tied to physical necessity and pricing power matter more, not less. Gold matters more. Energy matters more. Great businesses that can raise prices matter more. Productive real assets matter more. The fourth thing I do is stop taking reserve currency privilege for granted in my assumptions. The dollar may remain dominant for a long time and still deliver a much rougher path for holders of long-duration claims than the public expects. Dominance is not immunity. That is another lie people learn too late. And the fifth thing I do is watch the auctions. Markets can hide many things. Auctions are more honest. If demand weakens, tails widen, yields clear higher, and official buyers keep stepping back. The machine is telling you the truth, even if the politicians are not. Now let me give you the identity shift I think matters most here. The ordinary investor thinks like a stock picker or an index passenger. The prepared investor must start thinking like a funding realist. That is the shift from stock watcher to funding realist, from equity tourist to capital structure thinker, from will the market go up to funds the machine at what price and what happens when that price changes. Once you make that shift, a lot of comforting nonsense stops working on you. You stop being hypnotized by every intraday move in the SP. You stop treating Treasury yields as background noise. You stop believing the United States can endlessly borrow under deteriorating trust conditions without eventually paying a larger bill. And you start understanding why the Treasury market matters more than most earnings reports ever will. This also changes how you read policy. A president can demand lower rates all he likes. He does not set the market clearing yield alone. The more pressure policy applies to suppress that reality, the more the market starts wondering what exactly is being hidden. Tariffs raise inflation pressure. War spending widens deficits. Allies' hedging payment systems signal trust erosion. Oil shocks intensify dollar demand abroad, while simultaneously worsening America's own inflation arithmetic. Each of these makes the refinancing machine louder. This is why I do not think the real issue is whether America can technically refinance the debt. Of course it can. For a while, the issue is at what cost, at what yield, with what confidence damage, with what crowding, out effect, with what reserve consequences, with what long-run transfer of national vitality into debt service. That is the true bill, and I think the bill is rising faster than the public understands. If this continues, by late 2026 net interest can push decisively through $1 trillion on an annualized basis. By 2030 or so, $1.5 trillion does not sound at all absurd. By the mid-2030s, the Congressional Budget Office already sees $2 trillion or more as plausible. That is not a functioning growth strategy. That is a civilization paying tolls to its own past mistakes. No country likes to admit it is there. No electorate likes to hear it, but markets eventually insist. So let me be very clear about what I think is happening. Beneath the surface, foreign central banks selling treasuries is not the crisis. It is the X-ray. It shows you the bone structure of the problem. The problem is not that 1 month saw $82 billion leave custody holdings. The problem is that the old architecture of automatic external sponsorship is eroding exactly as America enters a refinancing wave that was manageable only under older trust assumptions. That is the picture. That is why I care. That is why you should care. The question is not whether the machine keeps moving. The machine will keep moving. The question is whether you are still treating that movement as a sign of health, or whether you finally understand that a machine can keep running long after it has become dangerous to stand too close to it. I know what I would choose. I would rather stand with liquidity than duration. I would rather stand with pricing power than fixed promises. I would rather stand with hard assets than blind faith. And above all, I would rather understand the rollover machine before it teaches its lesson through force. That is the real opportunity in moments like this. Not prediction for the sake of prediction. Clarity before the crowd. The crowd will notice later. It always does. But later is expensive. And later, in a refinancing trap, is often the price people pay for confusing a still functioning machine with a healthy one,